Elizabeth was a 27-year-old woman. She came to my clinic with a 3-year-old infertility problem, for which no organic cause had been found. So I took her medical history, examined her and questioned her in order to establish the various Zangfu diagnoses. For the past 3 years, she had been undergoing a psychological therapy because, according to her own words, she had great difficulty in knowing what she wanted and how she felt. All she knew is that deep down she was very afraid and that she had always been feeling second best. She also told me that nothing seemed to make her happy. Elizabeth liked to socialize with her close friends and enjoyed sports and outdoor activities, but she could not generally devote herself to these pleasures, as she was almost always worried about her husband, a chronic anxiety sufferer who was introverted and controlling. Elizabeth's father was loving and nurturing, but unable to protect her from the character of her mother, an extremely competitive woman who established this competition on 2 levels: as a woman and as a vision person, both in the feminine archetype and in the masculine archetype, as we have already established. As a consequence of this influence on her mother, Elizabeth always tried to live up to her expectations. On one hand, she would try to please others so that she'd be liked and accepted. And on the other hand, she felt that she had to be strong and, in her own words, to be able to get on in life. It has been many years since this clinical case, and this is why I started my treatment with the usual weekly sessions, which are more or less standard, dedicated to balancing the energy of her organ and viscera in order to promote her fertility. After 13 sessions, we decided to establish a rest period, and it was precisely in that last session I decided to puncture Ren Mai 14. Despite having agreed on a break following this treatment, she phoned again to request a new appointment. And when I saw her, she told me that now she felt very clearly what she wanted, even to the point of voicing her doubts to her partner about having a child with him. So it was in that trance that we resumed the treatment. A month later, this woman had decided to separate from her partner, was looking for a flat, announcing that she felt liberated from being constantly dependent on her husband's moods. These were her own words: "I still don't know how I want to live, and I'll have to find out by experimenting. But what I now do know very clearly is how I do not want to live." Over the course of 8 months, I had treated Elizabeth on 5 more occasions for various setbacks. Her life had utterly changed. She had stopped smoking, she felt satisfied, she was open meeting other people, and she was looking forward to the adventure that was lying ahead. And all this turning point was the result of the isolated stimulation of Ren Mai 14 Jiao. I found this case interesting because it illustrates 2 aspects. To begin, the type of treatment you do with acupuncture has different effects. Second, it shows how the stimulation of a Ren Mai point allows one to get in touch with what one feels deeply, and also it helps the person to turn their wishes into reality, which is a yin function. Alice, 49 years old, had already had acupuncture treatment before. She came to the clinic for diarrhea that was diagnosed 5 years ago as irritable bowel syndrome. The stools, which vary between 1 and 4 times a day, were sometimes soft or liquid, although not too smelly, and were often triggered by emotional disturbances. Other current problems were a long-lasting glaucoma, whose start coincided with a difficult working period. She was also suffering from a complex headache affecting Xiao Yang and accompanied by nasal mucus, relieved by the local application of cold and pressure. This headache was usually triggered by cold weather or alcohol consumption. There was no other pathological history apart from some episodes of sciatica due to a herniated disc. Her pulses were deep and diminished in the right cone position related to the lung. Now I turn to ask about her emotional biography. The daughter of a single mother, Alice had been adopted by relatives, although she later had moved back in with her mother. She had always fallen in love with quite independent men, and she had left such relationships so that they would never hurt her anymore, in her own words. As her Zangfu diagnosis had probably been treated when she had had acupuncture, I was inclined to approach the case from another point of view. This woman had low self-esteem, both as a woman and a person. She felt very vulnerable and was extremely pleasing. She described herself as an emotional sponge and admitted that she often held back her spontaneous expression so as not to upset or offend others. Alice had both a poor physical and emotional proprioception. She did not pay attention to herself, and when you asked her, "How are you?" I saw she found it difficult to felt it and to express it clearly. In the first treatment, I tried lung 2, which is a point on the metal sphere that allows the yang to open towards the periphery. And I did so taking into account the pulses too. She improved for 3 days, and after a week I repeated the same point. But this time it was very bad. It led to a worsening of the diarrhea. As you'll see later, sometimes bad results are very important to be analyzed because they are pointing out that we have to do something exactly the opposite. Therefore, the next week I did gallbladder 35, which is the creative point of Ren Mai. Still no improvement. And it was then that I decided to choose a Ren Mai point, Ren Mai 16, Zhong Ting, which can be translated as Great Central Hall. This acupoint brings down the fire, the heat, and the yang from the upper jiao, redirecting it downwards towards the center. And I chose this point because lung 2, which rather raises the qi, had worsened the diarrhea. And that made me think that her diarrhea was a consequence of a lack of qi in the lower jiao, which was incapable of containing the stools. Well, 2 or 3 days after, the diarrhea had disappeared. So the following week, I stimulated her with kidney 7 and lung 11 in order to clear dampness. And then we moved on to fortnightly treatment. When I saw her again, she still had no diarrhea. I repeated Ren Mai 16 and called her back for 2 months. After that time, there was no diarrhea. She felt much less vulnerable, and I repeated Ren Mai 16 and told her to come back whenever her symptoms returned. I have not had to treat her for over 8 years now. I find this case interesting because the clinical indications for Ren Mai 16 do not include, in fact, diarrhea, which invites us to reflect that the clinical indications described in the classical texts cannot possibly be exhaustive. They are rather brushstrokes that allude to the dynamics of each acupoint. And I also find it interesting to see how a single acupoint, when it is the right one, in very few treatments, is capable of resolving diarrhea that has been going on for 5 years.